Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining me. It appears that the counting is, while not over in terms of the elections, that we've got more clarity. I'm very, very pleased that the Democrats kept the House, kept the Senate, and that's going to allow me to continue to be chairman of the Intelligence Committee. I'm also both pleased and surprised at how well the Democrats did across the country. And while Kevin McCarthy will become Speaker of the House, and I wish him well, this may be one of the closest margins in very much in recent history. And my hope is that those more moderate Republicans in their conference will restrain some of the more extremist views. I think at the top line, I'm sure we'll get to questions on this subject, but that the overwhelming message I take away from the election is that Americans reject extremism on either side. They realize our democracy is worth fighting for and voting for. And we saw the demise of election deniers, but I'd also say to folks on the Democratic side, the out of the mainstream leftist agenda is also something that I think people are turning away from. The kind of bipartisan, centrist approach that I've been proud to be part of, and frankly, where we put enormous points on the board, whether it be on guns legislation, whether it be on the infrastructure bill, whether it be on the CHIPS bill, whether it be on the so-called Electoral Count Act, which I believe we will pass in the lame duck. I think it is an affirmation for those kind of bipartisan efforts. So I wanted to raise that at the top end. Next, the tragedy at UVA. How many times we have seen these kind of, brutal, senseless killings. I know people around Charlottesville, around the Commonwealth, around the country want to hear more from politicians than thoughts and prayers. I think this is, again, evidence that we need to do much more in terms of excuse me one second, you'd think somebody who quasi-invented cell phones could know how to turn off my devices before I go on air. But and that was quasi-invented in the framework of Al Gore and the internet.
Still going off, and they'll be picking it up on my computer.
Pardon me?
It's still going off.
This will go down in terms of, for those, nobody is old enough on this call to recall the last time I had a major technical glitch when I was doing a press event early on in my governorship and was doing a statewide radio and broadcast about some of the budgetary constraints. And I think I took the longest gulp of water ever, and got harassed by the press corps for literally weeks afterwards. But let me come back to the tragedy at UVA, which we need more than thoughts and prayers. It definitely means we ought to have and need to look at additional mental health. I think it again needs to reflect that we need appropriate gun safety legislation. Although again, as we've seen, we have taken steps in Virginia on gun safety, and there is no silver bullet. Although, while the evidence is still coming in, there appears to have been some red flags raised in terms of this young man's purchase of the firearm, and so more to know. But I think about this in terms of what it's the young men that were killed who had bright futures in front of them. In my own office, I had a former UVA football player who graduated a year or so before this group of young men came onto the team, but I just know how devastating it has been to him and all parts of the current UVA community, recent alumni. It is, again, a senseless tragedy, and whatever we can do at the local, state, and federal level to try to, as much as possible, prevent. Some of that means enforcement of existing gun laws. A lot of that goes to mental health issues. And it is unfortunately a crisis that takes place so many more times in America than any other industrial nation in the world. And we need to have the kind of honest conversations on this kind of issue around gun violence. Where too often we talk past each other. But to the UVA community, to the Charlottesville community, I know how much hurting is going on. I'm going to hit 2 or 3 other quick items, and then we'll take your questions. Ukraine, it is more and more evident that the tragedy that took place in Poland was the result of a Ukrainian missile taking down a Russian missile. That doesn't relieve the obligation, I believe, that this wouldn't have happened except for Putin's unjust, senseless, over-the-top invasion of Ukraine, where while the Russian military cannot be successful on the ground, and we've seen as recently as the Russian retreat from Kherson, that Russian forces are reeling, that the new forces that have been conscripted and being thrown in to the front line almost as cannon fodder is causing huge casualty numbers. And I think it is very important, I hope in the lame duck session, that we continue to aid Ukraine, to give them the resources that they need, not to take the war by any means beyond the Ukrainian borders, but to be able to hold the gains and continue to push back. And we need to do this, continue to do this in concert with our Ukrainian allies. So, with our NATO allies. It's, I know there's been some who said, well, why don't we give them a lot more right now? We've got to keep this coalition together. And I don't want to give any of the European allies an excuse to, in a sense, bail out of the coalition if we get too far in front of where the overall NATO plus coalition is headed. 2 other quick items. One on a much happier note. Tuesday, I rode on the Silver Line from Dulles out into Loudoun County. This has been a long time coming. I made a joke that I was, in 1991, I was a relatively young member of the Commonwealth Transportation Board, and I was at a public hearing and frankly getting yelled at by a whole lot of motorists who want us to open the access road permanently to traffic. We were doing construction on the toll road. If we'd done that, chances are we would have never been able to build and finish the rail to Dulles. And I pointed out that Secretary Buttigieg in 1991 was in 3rd grade. So the fact that this has taken way too long is absolutely the case. And in my mind, it also calls out the need that we have across the board, not just on the Silver Line, that we do need permitting reform in this country. As we think about, for example, a transition to clean energy or a cleaner energy mix, you got to be able to build stuff. And too often in our country, the litigation process, the permitting process takes way too long. And that issue, as we think about bringing jobs back to this country, transitioning to cleaner energy, we've got to have an ability to say we're going to build things and it's not going to take 5 years to get the permits. I would also say, and I know there's been questions asked, that, I get the fact of what this does for Northern Virginia and taking cars off the road. If you live in Roanoke, if you live in Richmond, if you live elsewhere in the state, why does opening the Silver Line make any difference to you? Well, by increasing the traffic at Dulles, what you will see I believe in the coming months will be an increase in the amount of international traffic going out of Dulles, the amount of international bargain traffic going out of Dulles. So those Virginians who have international travel in their future, I think, are going to have more options and cheaper options coming out of Dulles in the coming months. So this is good. It's good for Virginia regardless of where you live. And then finally, yesterday, and I think a giant step forward, Congress and the Senate took the first step in terms of legalizing, gay marriage. It also, 62 votes we got on that. It also will make clear, and it was remarkable that I had these kind of questions asked after the Supreme Court decision on women's health care choices, where families in Virginia that were interracial couples were being asked whether their marriages were going to be at stake. So this bill, while it is being viewed as legalizing gay marriage, also legalizes and makes sure there's no attempt to roll back on interracial marriages across Virginia and across the country. And I actually believe when the final vote is taken, there will be many, many more than the 62 votes we got yesterday. So those are some of the topics at hand. I've gone a little longer than I'd like, so let me turn it over to Laura and be happy to take your questions.
Amy Bittner with Gray TV. Hi there, Senator. Thank you so much for taking questions today. I have a two-part question for you because I'm greedy. Number one, do you have an opinion on if Nancy Pelosi should stay as House Democratic leader, and can you comment on her impact on the Hill? And number two, gridlock is a huge concern with Republicans taking over the House. How will that change your legislative agenda in the Senate for Virginia?
Well, first of all, on the case of Speaker Pelosi, at least until January 6th, I have huge respect for her tactical skills. The fact that she was able to manage a Democratic caucus with a very thin majority, whether you agree with her policies or not, was quite a legislative feat. And I think she's going to supposedly make a decision or announcement even today. I'm going to let her weigh in on that subject. In terms of what that new House majority is going to do, I think it's a real jump ball. I've dealt with Kevin McCarthy a number of times. For example, on Intel matters, on the so-called Gang of Eight. I feel like I've got a good working relationship with Mr. McCarthy. How he manages some of the folks who are in the House who are kind of the kind of that seem like their sole intent in Congress is to wreck the functioning of Congress. Boy, oh boy, it's going to be a tough task. I hope that that we could see a House of Representatives where Mr. McCarthy doesn't feel like he has to appease every member of his caucus, and if he could get the majority of his caucus and then, say he gets 150 Republicans and 100 Democrats, boy, oh boy, that would be, that would be the way the founders set up our system, where both sides actually have to compromise. In terms of part of my legislative agenda, I had dinner last night with Mike Turner, Republican congressman from Ohio, who is the new incoming House Intelligence Committee chair. I've gotten to know him. I think we're going to have a strong working relationship. I've been very proud that the Senate Intelligence Committee has been the last functioning bipartisan committee, I would argue, in the whole Congress. And one of the things I talked to Mr. Turner about last night is, we have already made huge progress, for example, out of the Intelligence Committee, because we're the de facto technology committee, on calling out and warning America about Huawei and the whole development of what's called 5G technology. That came out of our committee. I partnered with Republican Senator John Cornyn, led the efforts on the CHIPS bill to bring the manufacture and R&D around semiconductors back to this country. I think our economic competition with China is the issue of our time. Our committee is going to look at the whole issue around synthetic biology in terms of what that does for drug production, what that does for food production, what that does in terms of material sciences and chemicals, and how we need to make sure America and our allies maintain the lead there. And we're also going to take a look at advanced energy. 20 years ago, we controlled the whole solar line of production. We let that all move away. Can we move some of that back? We're all seeing these movement towards electric vehicles. We've got to look at batteries and storage. That's another area where we're going to dive into. And I still believe that nuclear power needs to be part of our future mix. And this new notion of small modular nuclear reactors offers great potential. And we're seeing Russia and China already sell these systems around the world. We need to get back in the game, and I'd say to folks, I think there are ways for safe, efficient nuclear power. We see that every day with our sailors on aircraft carriers and submarines with nuclear power. So I think, and again, on a Virginia-centric standpoint, there's an awful lot of that coming out of Lynchburg. So I think in terms of my legislative agenda, I may actually have a House Intelligence Committee that is going to be more bipartisan and more functioning. And I think in terms of competition with China, this is an issue where there's still broad bipartisan consensus.
Senator, our next question will be Kelsey Childress with WSET.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your morning. Just following that UVA shooting, you briefly spoke on there's mental health and gun safety legislation. So what are changes that you would like to see, and what are the next steps in making that happen as fast as possible?
I wish I had a notion on mental health support where I thought, here's Bill X that I think is going to solve this whole issue. I know earlier this summer I was at a facility in Northern Virginia, and it had representatives from mental health organizations across Virginia, and we were talking about them. I believe it's 988, the new number you can call, around suicide prevention, and I think there offers great potential there. But the lack of counselors, the lack of personnel who've got training in mental health, the availability of those kind of counselors, particularly in more rural areas, this is one more workforce shortage issue that I think we need to address, and whether the idea of some level of student debt relief or other incentives to get people into the field of mental health counseling is extraordinarily important, number one. Number two, even where we've got services that are available, making sure they're taken advantage of. One of the great tragedies in our country, and we feel it disproportionately in Virginia because we have so many veterans, are the number of veteran suicides every day. We find as we see these tragedies take place, about 2/3 of the veterans who commit suicide never have had any kind of ongoing interaction with the VA. The VA has a lot of mental health services. Veterans like to be served by other veterans. How we can make that funnel to get veterans connected to the service that are offered makes a lot of sense. I think there is a continuing challenge at our colleges and universities about trying to both identify and then connect students who are struggling with mental health professionals, and how we, I don't know how you legislate that avoids the kind of stigma that I think too many young people feel by acknowledging they've got issues. They've got problems. I mean, I would argue in a post-COVID world, I don't think there is a family in Virginia, including my own, that doesn't have some family member that's struggling at this point. And this is going to take kind of an all hands on deck. It's going to take legislation. It's going to take working with friends in the faith community. I don't have the silver bullet answer here. But I am wide open for ideas, suggestions, and comments. On the issue of gun safety, I still think the kind of rules we put in place in Virginia in, I believe it was the 2019 session of the General Assembly, kind of strike a pretty good balance. It is clear there's no efforts to take away somebody's shotgun or restrict your ability to hunt, but I think in terms of whether it's one gun a month or the appropriate background checks, the boyfriend loophole, the idea that on some reasonable restraints on assault weapons, weapons of war. Again, it's not going to solve every problem, but it is, when you hear law enforcement cry out for this, I think it makes sense, and I think these are tools. And I think, again, in terms of the tragedy in Charlottesville, we need more information, but it appears at first blush that there may have been warnings that should have triggered some further review. But let me be clear, that is just the first line of reporting, and I'm going to withhold judgment until we get all the facts.
Senator, our next question will be Isabella Ladon with WDBJ.
Senator, thank you so much for your time today. Kind of following up to Kelsey's question from WSET, like you had just mentioned, there were previous charges and there was a history of purchases and reports with the shooter at UVA. Are lawmakers working to change how previous crimes are reported to universities to prevent further violence, similar to what happened at Virginia Tech as well?
Yeah, this is an issue that has been haunting us, obviously, for a long time. And I think about, my dear friend Tim Kaine, who was governor at the moment of the crisis at Virginia Tech. I know there are ideas about additional reporting. I want to take a fresh look at what is being proposed. I mean, there is this constant tension between what's called HIPAA, the privacy protection rules, I know are important. Although I remember one time a family member, not an immediate family, but a family member, when I couldn't even get information about my sister who had been in an accident, HIPAA becomes I think probably everybody on this line has had some frustration with this, but that those HIPAA protections, how they interfere with if there'd been a previous incident, trying to have that information both was gotten from law enforcement to authorities at a university. I am wide open on how we make sure this information is conveyed in a more efficient and effective way, recognizing as well that people do have there needs to be protection of people's personal information. But when you've got somebody who's had prior incidents, particularly involving firearms, a university ought to know, and I also think, the gun shop ought to know. And I'm not going to. The last thing I want to do, since this is an active investigation, is say something here where I don't have all the information. But this is an area that I intend to, one, get better educated on, and hopefully we could find some path. I mean, again, end of the day, there is no perfect solution here. But I think about these 3 young men who are on the team who had an incredibly bright future. I think about at least one of the wounded who is still struggling for their life. What these young people could have done with their life, we're never going to know. And that kind of tragedy, how it seeps into the community. I mean, I remember years afterwards, visiting the memorials at Virginia Tech, and it took years to rebound. I mean, the idea that that the UVA Cavalier community is going to have to go through that. I mean, I think about, again, this is not, as we've seen, let's not forget that we had an incident at Bridgewater earlier this year. So, young people should be able to go to college and feel safe and feel like the university and law enforcement are doing all they can to keep those kids in a safe environment.
Our next question is Jim Spencer with the Daily Progress.
Thanks for taking the question, Senator. I want to ask you about the new history standards that the state has just put out that they've become for educating people. I know you're a federal politician, but this is part of a larger effort in Virginia to maybe change the way we educate our kids. And wondering about the controversy that's surrounding the attempt to change the way we teach history to children in Virginia. Have you looked at it very much? And even if you haven't, do you have feelings about how things ought to be represented in terms of balance and the teaching of history, institutional slavery and or discrimination, that sort of stuff?
Yeah, Jim, thank you. Thanks for that question. Listen, I start with the belief that you've got to have high standards in our schools. I remember when I was elected governor, folks thought because I was a Democrat I was going to roll back the SOLs. I didn't, because I do think you have to have independent, effective measurements. I mean, the old analogy that you keep score in a basketball game, you got to keep score in terms of how our kids are doing. And failure to keep score, I think, cheats a lot of those kids. We saw in the NAEF scores, which are the more national scores, that we saw some fallback in Virginia, although I would also argue we saw fallback in virtually every state. I am not as fully familiar with the current controversy around the history standards. I know the state board, it felt like the process from reading from abroad was being, seemed to be a little bit too much intervention. And I think it's incumbent on us in Virginia to teach all of Virginia's history, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We should be proud as Americans. I think one of the things I've said in prior times with you guys is, one of the things that in my mind has come out of the Ukrainian conflict was when we had this kind of moral ambiguity about how America is. In my mind, the courage of the Ukrainian people to basically put their lives on the line, to try to have a system in Ukraine that we take for granted every day in America, the right of free speech, the right to agree and disagree, the right of a free press, the right to have your votes counted. In my mind, that kind of reinforced the clarity that, for all our flaws in our country, we live in the best system in the world. We live in the system that other countries around the world aspire to. We live in the country where economic opportunity abounds. You don't see anybody trying to break into Russia or China. But if we are that strong, and we are that strong a country, then we should not be unwilling to talk about our history, the good, the bad, and the ugly. The enormous blot on America's history and Virginia's history that slavery entailed, the enormous blot that massive resistance that was Virginia specific entailed, the fact that for way too long, we didn't grant women any kind of fair access to vote and to rights. We are, always in search of that more perfect union. And I think that teaching our full history of American Virginia is part of that effort of our strides towards a more perfect union, and having an educated student population that realizes, all the good, the bad, the ugly, how we've, for a long, long time mistreated GLBT community. That's part of our history. And I think there has been, candidly, I'm still willing, I'm still waiting for the first level of evidence that so-called critical race theory or some of these, postgraduate type education theories, many of which I don't agree with, show me the evidence where those kind of tools are actually being taught in our K-12 system. I think that sometimes has been used as a political talking point. But on the specifics of the history, Jim, something seemed to be a little bit funky that, it felt like the process had gone on, and then I know it's been extended. But let me again, not unlike what I said in terms of the Charlottesville circumstance, let me make sure I'm speaking from a factual basis first. But thank you for the question.
Our next question will be Bill Atkinson with the Petersburg Progress Index.
Thank you, Laura. Senator, always good to speak with you. Thanks for the time this morning. My question is two parts. First question I have for you is Chris Jones's father has referred to his son as being, quote unquote, paranoid and fearful of being bullied, even while in college. And you touched on this a little bit when you were talking about the mental health issues facing the students in college. Do you think we need to put a major focus on the fact that school bullying is not just something that is on the elementary school playground, that it's at all levels in school? And the second part of my question is, we've already started hearing from people around here about the perception of Petersburg and the court of public opinion. What would you say to the people of Petersburg, where the shooter lived, albeit briefly, to reassure them that while thankfully something like this is a once-in-a-blue-moon occurrence in Charlottesville, in places like Petersburg, where violence is almost a daily way of life, and places like Petersburg will never be, quote-unquote, lost in the shuffle when it comes to attention and assistance with curbing violence? I know the latter part is probably more opinion than fact, but I'd be interested to hear what you have to say.
Joe, as always, thanks for, two very thoughtful questions. I think the notion of bullying or the fraternity hazing process has gone way too far. I am a proud co-sponsor, along again with my friend Tim Kaine, and I want to make sure I get it right. I think it's called the Love Like Adam Foundation, where there was a young man at VCU, was during COVID, and his people were slowly coming out. He was joining a fraternity, and there was a level of abuse during a hazing ritual that cost this young man his life. And there's a lot of sessions and meetings I have in this job that I'll remember forever. I remember all the parents coming in after the massacre at Newtown in Connecticut, and I'll carry the memory of that meeting forever. I'll remember the first time sitting down with Andy Parker after his beautiful daughter Allison was murdered on TV. I'll carry that memory. I will carry the memory of Adam's parents coming in and telling me about their son and what happened at VCU's, and legislation that puts in place both a training process that I think it needs to take place at all of these universities. And my daughters were all involved in the sorority system. I'm not against fraternities and sororities, but where we take this bullying, this hazing, to an extent where you cause, if not just immediate damage, you may cause psychological damage that plays out at some later time. And I think we have to acknowledge that this is taking place way too many times. That doesn't mean you're going to, completely change every kid's college experience. But there again should be some path here, where at least people have some understanding about that some of these activities are just unacceptable. And again, candidly, we've seen this in ways today, and it's one of the reasons why I have been talking to you guys for years about the imprint of social media and the level of harassment and bullying. Doesn't have to take place in the physical world, but the amount that takes place in the virtual world is unprecedented. And I think particularly amongst young women, and some of this can come from with additional parental help, but some of this needs to come from these social media companies who are all about making money, all about sucking out personal information about your kids, but then pretend they bear no responsibility when horrible actions take place. Why this Section 230 reform, the get out of jail free card from these companies? How many more tragedies do we have to endure before we put some rules of the road in place? In terms of Petersburg, Joe, I mean, listen, we all know that there have been challenges in Petersburg. I felt when I was governor that I probably spent more time in Petersburg and in Petersburg schools than any community in the Commonwealth. And, I think there's been some progress. There's a lot of areas I don't agree with Governor Youngkin on, but I am glad to see that Governor Youngkin has taken a real interest as well in Petersburg. And Joe, one of the things we've talked about, on one of these press conferences, is the award that Petersburg and Richmond, but disproportionately Petersburg, won in terms of this Economic Development Challenge Grant, where we can start again the kind of next generation biotech manufacturing in Petersburg. If the image of Petersburg is that's the place where we're making insulin that's affordable at $30 a month, that's the place that Petersburg is part of kind of next generation R&D and life sciences. If that's the image that we can build for Petersburg over the next 10 to 20 years, and that becomes part of Petersburg pride, that kind of pride that comes with opportunity is every bit as valuable as any specific piece of legislation. So I have great hopes for Petersburg. I was with the Petersburg mayor recently, Sam, on talking through some of these issues. So I hope this investment and the kind of opportunity that says to those young people in Petersburg, gosh, there's a chance if I get through school that I can, there's world-class jobs available in Petersburg. I think that offers the kind of hope that candidly, since the loss of Boehringer Ingelheim and some of the other traditional industries may not have existed as much as we'd like to see.
Senator, our next question will be from Danielle Sandler with WVNS.
Hi, good morning, Senator.
Good morning.
My question to you is, how do you feel about Trump running again, and what kind of impact do you think this will have on the presidential election?
I think there is nothing positive or future-oriented about Donald Trump running for president again. This is a three-time loser who we see time and again doesn't have a vision for America, but wants to be frankly an object of self-pity and is constantly looking back. This may sound strange coming out of me, but I think America is healthier when you've got two strong political parties, a center-left party that's the Democrats, and I You've heard me call out many times when I feel like the Democrats have gone too far to their extreme, and a center-right a Republican Party. I want there to be a strong Republican Party, but it's got to be grounded in principles and ideas. I think a lot of the folks who are saying the Republican Party ought to be about ideas, the only idea that came out of many of the candidates that were Trump-backed this year was, a party of grievance, a party of anger, a party that simply wants to relitigate the 2020 election. And the most positive thing, in my mind, was the almost universal rejection of those candidates. And I think that's healthy for American democracy. And if we can get back to where the message that came out of too many of my Republican friends this year was simply, Biden bad, inflation bad, crime bad. Of course inflation and crime are bad. But I didn't hear a single idea proactively going forward on how we grapple with this. I didn't hear anyone that say, well, actually, the infrastructure bill that we put in place, which we've not spent out at all, long term will help bring down inflation because we're going to have a more efficient system, because we're going to have broadband to every community. That means you can live where you choose to live, and you don't have people driving up inflation. Everybody's got to move to an urban area. I didn't hear anybody complain about the fact that if we actually limit the cost of insulin to $35 a month, and I've shared with you, I got a daughter type 1 diabetic. I can afford her insulin, but the fact that we've got now seniors at $35 a month, that's going to bring down inflationary pressures. We ought to broaden that to all Americans. So frankly, the pitifulness of the kind of attack ads with no ideas, that kind of, in my mind, exemplifies the MAGA approach. Frankly, it might be good news for the Democrats if he continues to win, but I'm not sure it's sure as heck not good news for our country, and it's not good news for a Republican Party that I want to be strong, competitive, where we got to duke it out on the ideas about how we're going to make our country better, how we're going to make our Commonwealth better. That's where I hope our political debate can return to.
Senator, our next question will be Amy Knowles with the Virginia Dogwood.
Hey, Senator Warner, thanks for taking our questions. The last I heard, the World Health Organization still classifies COVID-19 as a pandemic, but I understand that in the Senate there was a bipartisan resolution to end the COVID-19 national emergency. I know that there's been some confusion about that, so I wondered if you could explain what that vote could mean or maybe could not mean for the average American.
Well, Amy, I know you always have got a good one near the end here, and let me. I know we're already at 42 minutes, so let me try to do the quickie version on this. There is not a single national emergency declaration. For example, one of the things that's in place that has been used by the Biden administration, started by the Trump administration, was something called Title 42 that frankly is one tool that's been used to try to slow the level of migration at the border. And let's be clear, we need to fix the border. We need to rationalize things like our TPS folks here, our DACA students. We need immigration reform, but part of that immigration reform needs to be a strong and secure border. The thing I voted in favor of yesterday would not have dealt with Title 42. One of the things that came out of that I thought was a positive that came out of COVID, and I say that in quotes, was the fact that we could greatly enhance the use of telehealth. We talked earlier about the tragedy in Charlottesville and the lack of mental health providers. Charlottesville has luckily an abundance of mental health providers. There's a lot of places in Virginia, frankly, Amy, and across Southside that don't have enough. Telehealth is an opportunity, and I think we ought to put some of those changes and make them permanent. What I voted on yesterday would not have dealt with this. This was a narrow component part. Chances are it's not even going to get through the House, but I think, as President Biden has said, I think it is time for us to start to turn the page. Does that mean that COVID has disappeared? No. Within the last, there have been family members of my own family, including myself, that have had, COVID in the last couple of months. We still need to test. We still need to take appropriate safety precautions. But my fear is this is a challenge we're going to have to continue to live with. And I think it is time to start in a bipartisan way, start rolling back and getting us back to normal. I am strongly in favor, for example, of getting our federal workforce back in the office. I think that's incredibly important because so many Virginians, you work in law enforcement, you work at the post office, you work, at the grocery store, you work at the drugstore. You've never had any option of doing anything other than working in person. And I think it's time for us to start that process back. And I thought it was important yesterday, while this was not the perfect vehicle by any means, to say that I want to cast my vote in terms of us getting back to normal. We're going to have to live with variations of COVID going forward. And, if the medical science, we end up with a strain that is extra tough, we may have to re-grapple with that. But, we live in a global world and a global economy. The ideas of how we grapple with pandemics, is going to be an ongoing issue. It is one of the whys I say, while I'm chairman of the Intelligence Committee, making sure that we have a plan around synthetic biology, that we have the next generation developments, that we are not reliant on the source of our so-called APIs that go into the basic chemistry around our drugs coming from China, is a national security issue. It's not just a healthcare issue. So this is why this agenda around life sciences and biology is a national security issue, and it's something I'm going to take on. I know I'm getting the high sign. Is that the last? I know I think this may go as the longest one of these I've ever done. But do we have any last words, or was that the last question?
One more question.
All right.
We have one more question from Joe Thomas, WCHV.
Well, I was wondering whether Joe would, All right, Joe, fire away. Give me one of your zingers.
No zingers on this one. This is actually going back to a quote you gave the Associated Press in 2018 on Google and tracking privacy and the $392 million settlement they just reached with Virginia and 39 other states because after uploading tracking apps into their cell phones, especially Android cell phones, during COVID, they continued to keep that tracking information going. In the states have won some smackerels of money. What is your view on this settlement? Did it go far enough? And should the states have pressed further for protecting our Third and Fourth Amendment rights to not be surveilled, even though somewhere on page 495 of a user agreement we clicked, I accept. And as a subtext to that, do we need to have better informed consent on some of this stuff?
Oh. Amen. Yes. It is the reason why, we are now following California. We have a law on privacy in Virginia, and I commend the General Assembly for their work, but we've deferred all this to the Europeans. So the very idea of knowing your rights, and as you said, not on page 453 where you didn't know there's a final I agree, you are right whether there is additional litigation. I'm not sure. We could solve this with a privacy bill. But Joe, let me give you fodder for your next question the next time to me. And we just put out a 35-page paper, which I would recommend to all of you, about cybersecurity in healthcare, where not only the question about what these platforms are keeping in terms of your personal information, but the fact that in many of these healthcare systems, they view cybersecurity as kind of a bolt-on after the fact. We have to realize that the threat around cyber in healthcare and our personal information is huge out there. The amount of ransomware paid per information in healthcare is higher on your personal health information than it is on your financial information or anything else. We just recently saw in Australia where a health system was hacked into, and every individual over a last number of years that had an abortion, their personal information was given out, where they lived, their phone number, their Australian equivalent of Social Security number, because the healthcare system didn't pay the ransomware. So, yes, on stopping the tracking of information without, fulsome agreement in a intelligible consent form, giving people more data on what their information is worth, so you don't think that these are not free services. These are services that suck out your personal information and monetize it. And in the case of a company like TikTok, your kid's information is probably residing on some server in China right now for potential future use by the Communist Party. And in this issue around cyber and healthcare, I'll just close with this, which is we have to almost rethink our whole healthcare system to the fact that from healthcare devices to patient records to how information is kept, this has to be built into the cost of healthcare and not viewed as an add-on after the fact. There's a lot of benefits, as we all know, that come from technology. My business was technology. I am, forward-leaning. But with every major technological advance, there is oftentimes a dark underbelly as well. And a more informed Congress, a more informed population, sorting through the good, the bad, and the potential choices is so important. And it is why that the Intelligence Committee, whether it is advanced energy, whether it is these questions around biology and particularly synthetic biology, the ability to grow new drugs, the ability to grow new types of food, is an area where even with a House that's going to be very close, I think there's going to be ability to put points on the board. You look at this last Congress, if 2 years ago with a 4 or 5 seat margin, whatever it was in the House, and a 50-50 Senate, none of you guys, and maybe I wouldn't have even predicted, they would have said that we would have done as much and as productive, from infrastructure to chips to guns to respecting our veterans to making sure that there's not an ability for a vice president to mess with the People's Choice in terms of the Electoral Count Act. And frankly, a lot of the things around clean energy and around negotiating on drug prices, even though it was passed only with Democrats, a lot of my Republican friends would have been supportive of that. So I don't start this next 2 years process with thinking that gridlock is going to be the default option. I hope and pray that people of goodwill from both political parties are going to be willing to step up. Lord knows we've got enough problems in this country. And as we've shown, I think when we put our minds to it, we're going to come up with solutions. They're not going to be perfect 100% of the time by any means. No, newsflash there that Congress doesn't 100% get it right. But if they are bipartisan, we then both own the solution. And if we have to come back and refix, we can do it together. I apologize to all of you for almost a 54-minute session here. I'm going to sign off now because if I go much longer, none of you will ever come back to one of these sessions. So everybody be safe, and I probably won't hear from you in a group way before Thanksgiving. Have a very blessed Thanksgiving, and I hope you all take a moment and give thanks for the fact that with all our challenges, as I said earlier, we are still blessed to live in the greatest country in the world.